Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 719 for August 12th, 2018. Coming up in a few minutes.
All right, welcome to the distilling side of the operation. So everything that we saw on the other side is just wash production. That's all brewing. That is solely for the production of Westward single malt. And it's pumped over here to distill out. It's all pot stills. We have no column or combination stills here. It's 100% pot still.
I spent most of this week in Portland, Oregon, where there's a Distillers Row on the southeast side of town, with craft distillers making everything from aquavit to vodka. The specialty at House Spirits is its Westward single malt whiskey. And head distiller Miles Munroe will take us on a tour of the distillery on WhiskyCast In-Depth. That's coming up later, along with the calendar of events, your voice, the What I'm Tasting This Week department, and much more. All on this edition of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
This is whiskey, Johnnie Walker's Scotch whiskey, from this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnnie Walker Black Label. Step right up.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. We've had our first update on cleanup work at the Barton 1792 Distillery in Bardstown, Kentucky, following the collapse of a rickhouse with around 18,000 barrels of whiskey inside. Sazerac released a video this week showing workers using a pair of cranes to remove barrels one at a time from the top of the pile for inspection. Kentucky.com reports damaged barrels are being evaluated to see whether they can be repaired without draining the whiskey inside. Those that can't are being emptied into tanks until the whiskey can be rebarreled. There's no word yet on how many barrels have been salvaged so far. The project is expected to take several months. 12 years after the first bottling of Templeton Rye hit the market in 2006, it's now being distilled in Iowa. Templeton Rye's new $35 million distillery opened this week and will be able to produce up to 500,000 proof gallons of whiskey each year. The brand will still be sourcing whiskey from MGP in Indiana for at least the next 4 years, while the whiskey being distilled now in Templeton matures. There's also a new whiskey to celebrate the opening, a 6-year-old special reserve edition of Templeton Rye matured in Iowa. We'll have more on this on an upcoming episode of WhiskyCast. Meanwhile, Louisville's new Rabbit Hole Distillery has opened to tours this week. Tours will be available Wednesdays through Sundays, with tickets selling for $23 each, including a guided tasting. You can listen to my interview with Rabbit Hole founder Kaveh Zamanian in episode 642 of WhiskyCast. It's in the archives at whiskycast.com. Also at the eastern end of Louisville's Whiskey Row, Old Forester is unveiling this year's edition of its birthday bourbon. It's the 18th annual edition and celebrates the birthday of Brown-Forman founder George Garvin Brown on September 2nd. This year's edition was the first to be bottled at Old Forester's new distillery on Main Street. It comes from 120 barrels filled back in 2006 and is bottled at 50.5% ABV. That makes it the strongest birthday bourbon yet. Around 14,400 bottles will be available with a recommended retail price of $99.99 each. I'll have my tasting notes for it soon at whiskycast.com. On the Scotch whiskey front, Distell is releasing 6 new limited edition single malts from its distilleries, with 2 new Bunnahabhains. The 2008 Moyne is matured in Bordeaux red wine casks, and there's a new Palo Cortado sherry cask finish as well. Tobermory has a new 12-year-old Fino sherry cask finish, along with two 19-year-old peated Lechigs from 1998. One is finished in Oloroso sherry casks, the other in Pedro Jimenez sherry casks. And finally, there's a 2008 brandy cask finish from Deanston. The whiskies will be officially unveiled at a special event in London, September 12th. The Macallan is releasing the latest in its Masters of Photography series. The 7th edition in the series features 6 photographers from Magnum, one of photojournalism's legendary agencies. They were turned loose around the new Macallan distillery in Speyside during the entire construction process to document the project. As for the whiskey, it was created by the Macallan's Sarah Burgess from 8 different casks. It'll be available at the distillery's Visitors Center and at select whiskey shops worldwide. No word yet on pricing. Isle of Arran is releasing one of its oldest whiskeys yet. Broddick Bay is the first in the distillery's new Explorers series, and Arran Managing Director Ewan Mitchell says the series will celebrate some of the island's unique features.
Well, Broddick is the port you arrive into when you take the ferry across to Arran. So we thought it was, and it's a beautiful panorama with the village and Broddick Castle in view. So we thought that was a suitable starting point in this exploration of some beautiful locations on the island with this new series. And it seems to be going down very well. The first release, Broddick Bay, was a 20-year-old, and it was a mix of both bourbon and sherry casks, sherry hogsheads, and recast into sherry butts, which we sourced from Bodegas Tradición, which is one of the most traditional sherry bodegas in Jerez, and we think it's just got a really nice classic old style Arran character to it. So there's a nice bit of the sherry gives it a nice bit of backbone, but it doesn't completely dominate. You still get lots of sweet, fruity, spicy characteristics coming through as well.
Where do you plan to take this series after this one?
Well, the next edition will actually be celebrating our home of Lochranza itself, so that'll be coming out for the spring next year. And James is working away with some casks in the warehouse and working his magic, and we'll look forward to the next edition in the series.
Work is continuing this summer on Arran's second distillery at Lag on the southern end of the island. We'll have more on that with Ewan Mitchell next time around. And finally, South Africa has become the latest country to officially protect Scotch whisky with a trademark granted to the Scotch Whisky Association. That allows the SWA to go after counterfeit whiskies being passed off as Scotch whisky. Exports of real Scotch to South Africa rose almost 21% last year, with a value of around £144 million. That's nearly $184 million. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. The news is brought to you by Highland Park, the Orkney's single malt with Viking soul. The Vikings loved to explore, and you can follow in their footsteps with the latest release in the Valhalla collection. Look for Valknut soon at a whiskey shop near you. Find out more at highlandparkwhiskey.com. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. McTeers and Bonhams both have whiskey auctions coming up this Friday, August 17th. The McTeers auction will be at its gallery in Glasgow, Scotland, and Bonhams will hold its auction at its Hong Kong gallery. Tickets are still available for the Whiskey Guild's annual New York City Whiskey Cruise, August 23rd. The Bourbon Women will hold their annual Symposium Conference, August 24th through the 26th at the Brown Hotel in Louisville, Kentucky. And the Bourbon Mixer is on the 25th in Louisville as well. The Stauning Whiskey Festival is also on August 25th in Stauning, Denmark. The Virginia Craft Spirits Roadshow hits Richmond and the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts August 29th. Spirit of Speyside Distilled is August 31st and September 1st at the Elgin Town Hall in Elgin, Scotland. and Malt Stock 2018 is September 7th through the 9th in Nijmegen, the Netherlands. Right now, we have 180 different events on the searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. Just use the search button to find one near you.
This is whiskey. Johnny Walker's Scotch whiskey. From this place, and these places in that place. These are the people that make it. This is what they sound like.
Because you're a cheeky wee blighter.
Dance like. Aye, like that. This is what they do all day. Building the great character of Johnny Walker Black Label. Aging in oak for 12 long years.
Thanks. Oh, it's gorgeous there.
What is character? It's giving a damn.
You're all right, lassie.
Which looks like this, as much as this. See, the land that shapes these people and the people that shape this whiskey all shape how bloody good it tastes.
Put the bloody game on the telly, Ella.
A whiskey as bold as it is complex. For every step you take, this is Johnny Walker Black Label, friends. Step right up.
Cut.
Can I drink this now?
Johnny Walker Black Label Blended Scotch Whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume, imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. I spent most of the week in Portland, Oregon, visiting House Spirits with a group of other drinks writers. House Spirits started out as a small distillery in the Oregon wine country, making aviation gin and founder Christian Krogstad's Aquavit, then moved to a small site on Portland's southeast side and started laying down stocks of what would become Westward single malt whiskey. 3 years ago, House Spirits moved to its current distillery nearby, just a couple of 100 yards east of the Willamette River under Interstate 5. Christian Krogstad has turned over the day-to-day distilling work to Miles Munroe, who took us on a tour of the distillery Monday.
So this is where the whiskey making process begins for us. Malted barley is going to come out of the silo and go through our mill. You can see in this spent grain here how we crush the grain. Again, we're brewing this. We're making this very much as like a beer wash. So we don't have a hammer mill. We aren't, hammering this down into a powder. We're crushing it through our mill. We have a 2-roller mill that splits the grain open. You can see there's a lot of husk material, but then inside of that, these white kernels, that's what we're after. That's all that starch material. With enzymes inside the grain, when mixed with hot water, breaks down all the starches into sugars. So the yeast eats the sugar for food. It creates a lot of different compounds, but 2 of the main byproducts are carbon dioxide and ethyl alcohol. All right. This is the next step of the process. This is our brew house. This is where we're making the wash for distillation. This is a very typical craft brew system. We had this fabricated here in Oregon by a AAA metal fabricator. This is a 30-barrel system, and some of you may know this. A barrel in brewing terms, just a volume term, a barrel is 31 gallons. So that's like, if you ever heard of a full keg being referred to as a half barrel, it's because it's 15 and a half gallons. And so in brewing terms, a barrel, 31 gallons. So this is a 30-barrel system, meaning that we can make 30 barrels of beer on this at a time. These are our fermenters right here. These are 100-barrel fermenters. So again, we're brewing 3 times a day to fill one of these fermenters up. We're, I think, on our second brew today now. I let them know we were going to invade, so.
Going through the grain.
So you're seeing a very unique day here right now. I mean, we're solely making single malt whiskey here. This is, it's something we talked about when building this facility. If we wanted to, maybe make a bourbon or a rye or something, and
a full tank.
Right, exactly. Well, and and a lot of what you're handling in raw materials depends on the equipment that you have, and so we decided to just, we're focused on single malt. But actually, what you're seeing here is, and we'll actually get to try some of that when we're out at the barrel warehouse today. But a couple years ago, we threw about 10% of a malted rye into a batch just to try it, just to see what would happen, and it's turning out really well. So we did a couple more batches. So,
Miles, how different was it
in terms of the beer that you guys are making here compared to when you were getting it done outside?
Well, again, we have our own system here. We have our own setup. We have our own fermenters with temperature control, and we have my office, which is the lab, which we'll go in there as well, where we can do cell counts, where we can check to make sure everything's exactly how we want it. So we have complete control over the whole process now, so pretty different.
So it's consistent now compared to what you were getting?
Yes, and again, always going to breweries that we thought were, of good quality and made good beer. But yeah, it's all within our control now, so it's 100% us. Yeah, very, very much more consistent for sure. Just to kind of run through the brewing process for everyone, I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but what we're doing is we're milling that grain, we're mashing it into our mash lauter tun here. We're adding hot water, about 150 degrees Fahrenheit. That temperature of the hot water actually helps activate these enzymes, again, that break down the starches in the grain into sugars. And that's essentially what we want to do. We want to create this wort, this sugar-rich solution. There's a screened or false bottom here that we are able to draw that liquid off. We leave the grain behind, obviously. You can see it's dumped out here. Once it's done, it's sent off to the farm. That liquid will then go into our kettle, which is our second vessel back here. In brewing, you're boiling your wort and you're actually adding hops. That's an important part in the brewing process is you're adding all your hops and extracting all those acids to bitter up your beer. We're obviously not hopping our whiskey, but we do want to boil it because we want to make sure that we pasteurize that solution. So make sure there's no other bacteria or yeast, which is everywhere, could take over that fermentation. We want just the yeast that we select to actually run this fermentation. So we'll do a quick boil on it, cool it down, and then into our fermenters. We're using an ale yeast, which isn't very typical for whiskey production. But we love what's called esters that are produced from an ale yeast fermentation. A lot of great floral notes, a lot of great tropical fruit, honey notes. The yeast we use is so ubiquitous, it's referred to in most circles, brewing circles, as 001 yeast labs. It's pale ale yeast. It's also known as Chico yeast. It's basically the Sierra Nevada pale yeast. Chico, yeah. And actually, Chris John just pulled a sample straight from the fermenter. So go ahead and have a taste.
Like milk from the cow.
Right.
So like just a single sparge, just one.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so just no second water or anything like that. We're essentially, as we're lautering over to the kettle, running a sparge off the rings, just one good rinse. It's about 500 gallons of a sparge, so it's a significant sparge. It takes about 2 hours, 2.5 hours to sparge through, but it is just a single rinse after our Vorloff, yeah. So this wash was brewed on Friday. So this is day 3 of its fermentation. Our fermentation is taking about 4 to 5 days right now. We're fermenting at about 78 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a little hot for an ale yeast fermentation. But we really want to promote, like I said, a lot of those really nice esters, those organic acids of really nice floral fruit notes. And really, I challenge you to find a better whiskey wash than this. I mean, this is really nice on its own.
I've actually had a fair share amount of distiller's beer in my life. This is delicious. In comparison, because usually it's like sour and not good.
Yeah, not great.
Weird.
Yeah. I mean, in its own right. Yeah, it's minus the hops. It could pass for a pretty decent pale ale. Like it's. So actually on our second brew of the day right now, you can see here there's still the mash. You can, go on up and check it out, please. Have a look. So what we're doing is, it's called sparging. We were just talking about sparging, where we're actually using more fresh hot water to rinse that grain. We want to get every little bit of sugar that we can out of that, because any sugar left behind is alcohol left behind, and that's whiskey left behind. And that's just a sad thing. So as I said, siphoning all that liquid off the bottom, we're sparging right now with more hot water to just rinse every little bit out of that grain that we can possibly get. It's actually going from the very bottom. You can see in this pipe here with this sight glass, it's actually moving through the pipes right now. going into the kettle now where we'll boil it again, just a quick 10-minute boil to pasteurize that to make sure there's no other microorganisms in there to overtake the fermentation. I mean, we essentially need a sanitized environment inside our fermentation tanks to make sure it'll go exactly the way we want it. We're not doing any open top sour mash.
Not like rum.
No. Dump it in the ground, bury it. Does anyone have any other questions on the brewing process here?
Nope.
Any questions on the wash? You guys are good? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, we're working with yeast. We're working with microorganisms here. It's something that's essential to the flavor and the character of the whiskey itself. So my office is also a lab. That's where we're checking pHs. That's where we're actually counting the cells, actually doing a cell count on the yeast to make sure that there's enough and that it's active and that it's alive and it's going to do what we want to do. We don't want to, you know, brew 3,000 gallons of beer and then not have the yeast work. That's a sad day. It's a job opening, really. And so yeah, you know, it's at a micro level. We're dealing with microorganisms here, and it's something that, again, we're so focused on the integrity of the fermentation that it's absolutely very, very important to make sure that we have a quality system in place. Would anybody be interested in seeing a cell count, or should we move on to the distilling side? You want to see it? Oh, I was doing a cell count this morning on the yeast. Let's check it out. Steve, we're coming in.
Whoa.
Watch out, bud.
Whoa.
How's things?
Good.
This is Steve.
Hi, Steve.
Steve is the latest, greatest addition to our distilling team.
I like you to say that part, greatest.
We actually walked from dinner last night. We walked by Von Ebert Brewing, and that's where we grabbed this guy from. Stealing all the brewers. So this has been sitting here for probably 4 hours, so there's not a lot of alive stuff left in that. But if you want to take a look, what's going on here, the process is I will pull some beer wash off of a fermenter, which has a bunch of active yeast in it swooping around. I'll take a very small sample of that, and again, we're at a microscopic level, so there are hundreds of billions of trillions of yeast cells in that fermenter. And so for us to actually try to count and get an idea of how many are in there, we have to just dilute it quite a bit. So I'll take a 1 ml sample of an actively fermenting wash. I'll then dilute it to 80 times to really just get a reasonable look at how many yeast cells are in that solution.
What are you looking for?
So the cells will actually pop up. You'll see there's still a few in there. And so what we're looking for is an amount. It's going to work with the amount of the volume of beer we've given it.
Do you propagate yeast at all, or do you buy for each batch?
We work with local brewers to get their ale yeast from them. The very back tank in our brew house is actually a yeast brink where we will grow up to a bigger level of yeast pitches if we need. But yeah, mostly we're just sourcing from a couple breweries around town that have a great yeast program.
And again, that makes it an Oregon yeast.
Exactly.
It's Chico yeast. But
Yeah, no, precisely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's...
If it's going to mutate, it's going to mutate like Portland.
Exactly, yes.
Not going to mutate like the
Yes, precisely. All right, welcome to the distilling side of the operation. So everything that we saw on the other side is just wash production. That's all brewing. That is solely for the production of Westward single malt. And it's pumped over here to distill out. It's all pot stills. We have no column or combination stills here. It's 100% pot still. Pot distillation is the most basic, heat distillation process that there is. We're taking that fermented wash that's at about 8 to 9% ABV when it's done, and we're putting it into our still here. And essentially, distillation is a separation process, right? We're taking all that alcohol that's in solution and separating it out. We're heating it up. It's all about boiling points, right? So like water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, ethyl alcohol boils at around 171 degrees Fahrenheit. So when we heat this up to about 171 degrees, all that ethyl alcohol is steaming out and coming out, right? What's great about pot distillation is it's just each pass is one distillation, and so it really preserves a lot of the integrity, a lot of the flavor, a lot of the characteristics of that wash. And that's what we want to do because we've gone through so much trouble to create this really, really delicious, really well-made wash. We want to preserve everything that was created during that process. So this still was built custom for us down in Louisville, Kentucky by Vendome. Stainless steel pot with internal steam coils. And then we have all copper column, line arm, and condenser. That column itself was actually hand-formed, hand-hammered into place with a blowtorch and a hammer by them down there. This is a 3,000-gallon still, and that's a 700-gallon capacity still. And so when moving into this new space and trying to engineer this space, we were obviously trying to make it as streamlined as possible. So we thought, all right, well, to fill that up to capacity at 700 gallons of low wines, how much beer wash will that take? Well, about 3,000 gallons. So we had a 3,000-gallon pot still built. 3,000 gallons of beer, that's about 100 barrels of beer. Okay, well, let's get 100-barrel fermenters and a 30-barrel brew system and brew on that to fill them. So really, it's just reaching capacity at every level, and that's just the most efficient way to do things. So if you want to come up, everything's running, so there's not a whole lot of room up here, so maybe half. So these stills are running, so they're hot, so don't touch them. Yeah. But the design of this still here was deliberate, very specific to Westward. You can see how short this column is. Right. Again, we feel that the integrity of the spirit, where we're actually getting most of our characteristics, is in the fermentation process. And so we want to preserve all that. With a longer column, we would have more reflux. And more reflux means a cleaner spirit. Well, we've had a very clean fermentation, so we don't want to clean our spirit up too much because you're just removing more of the actual flavor and the characteristics of that spirit. So this is our first distillation, what we call the beer stripping run or our low wines run. We're taking that 3,000 gallons of 8 to 9% beer wash and distilling it out here into low wines. You can get a finger in there and have a taste if you like. It's really pretty nice. So yeah, this is our first run. These are our low wines coming off. And
what is that ABV coming off at?
Right now, probably really good 70 or so, or 70 proof. Okay. So probably about 35%.
Good morning.
Right? We'll collect down to about 10% or 20 proof, and then we're done with our first run. Yeah, get on in, have a taste, please. Because we have such a clean fermentation, we only actually collect about 5 gallons of heads off our low wines run. I mean, for a 3,000 gallon batch, that's a very small amount of heads. Again, dealing with a fermentation that's really clean, that's really cool, that isn't producing a lot of off flavors and strange compounds that we need to distill out. So it's really only about 5 to 6 gallons of heads that we're collecting off the first run. So we'll take that 700 gallons of low wines at about 35%, put into our second still here. And that's our high wines, our new make run that will run our second time. That's, of course, given the standards of identity, the laws concerning we're collecting under 160 proof, but it starts to come off at about 162. We collect about 2 to 3 gallons of heads off our second run. Again, just not very much at all. So we'll actually redistill the heads. So all these heads that come off these runs, we'll actually go back into the wash still and we'll redistill it out because there's still some good alcohol in there. We want to leave all those other strange compounds behind.
Is this your heads?
No, this is we're in the hearts of the high wines run right now. Yeah, go for it.
This is the good
Yeah, it's really, really nice. Yeah.
It's very into the gasoline.
What it also does, the second distillation, is also increases the proof because we have 700 gallons at 70 proof that we put in here. We'll collect about 250 gallons, and that's at about 70 to 72%.
Yeah. That's 142 proof right there?
When it's all said and done, when it's collected down there. Yeah, so we'll take the high wines at 140, and we'll blend it with some filtered water to just under 125. That's what we barrel at.
In addition to Westward whiskey, House Spirits still makes aviation gin for its current owners, who include actor Ryan Reynolds. It also makes Volstead vodka and produces Casa Magdalena Guatemalan rum, along with Christian Krogstad's namesake Aquavit. House Spirits is also one of the few distilleries with an airport tasting room, Its tasting room at Portland International Airport is after the security checkpoints and offers bottle sales as well as tastings. Full disclosure, I was in Portland this week as a guest of House Spirits and Visit Portland, but as always, full editorial control over the content of this segment remains with WhiskyCast. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Lagavulin, the legendary Islay single malt. Look for the classic 16-year-old Lagavulin, the Distiller's Edition, and the throwback 8-year-old Lagavulin at a whiskey shop near you. Find out more at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. You'll find my tasting notes for the regular Westward Oregon single malt on our website. I tasted it last year, but had the chance to taste 2 variations on that one while I was in Portland this week. There's a special edition of Westward produced for the Multnomah Whiskey Library Bar in downtown Portland. It's a blend of 2 single barrels that was allowed to rest for 4 months before bottling at 45% ABV. The nose is warm with muted spices, fruity notes of plums and red grapes, along with hints of honey and vanilla. The taste, it's fruity with a nice balance of baking spices, plums, peaches, baked apples, and honey. The finish is nice and long with gently fading spices and a good fruitiness. I'm scoring Westward's Multnomah Whiskey Library Blend a 92. Now, later this fall, Westward will release its annual 100-proof Pinot Noir single cask. It's still resting in a cask from Bergstrom Vineyards in the Willamette Valley right now, but I had the chance to taste the 2017 version. This one was finished for 14 months and bottled at 50% ABV. It was only available in Oregon, and the nose is fruity with red grapes, a hint of plums, and a nice maltiness. The taste has that same good balance of spices and fruity notes with red grapes and plums, complemented nicely by touches of baking spices, fresh berries, and barley sugar. The finish is long with lingering spices and hints of fruit in the background. A bit of water accentuates the fruity notes on the palate and the spices on the finish. I'm scoring the 2017 Westward 100 Proof Pinot Noir a 92. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, proud to announce the 2018 edition of Parker's Heritage Collection. This year's edition carries on Parker Beam's legacy of excellence and innovation with a unique bourbon finished in orange curacao barrels that accent the bourbon's own natural hints of citrus. Once again, sales of this year's edition of the Parker's Heritage Collection will benefit the ALS Association. You can find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Next up, let's look at the Sheep Dip Islay Blended Malt Scotch Whiskey from Ian MacLeod Distillers. As you might gather from the name, this one is a blend of single malts from several Islay distilleries, and it's bottled at 40% ABV. The nose, it's smoky and phenolic with hints of creosote and heather that are balanced nicely by honey and vanilla notes in the background. The taste, smoky and peppery with a good peatiness, balanced by honey, vanilla, and caramel candy notes. The finish is long and smoky with hints of caramel and honey in the background. And I'm scoring the Sheep Dip Islay Blended Malt an 89. Let's finish up with the bourbon from Black Dirt Distillery in New York's Hudson Valley. It's distilled from a mash bill of 80% local corn, 8% rye, and 12% malted barley, then matured for 3 years and 8 months and bottled at 45% ABV. The nose has notes of charred oak, soft spices, caramel, and hints of linseed oil and lemon zest. The taste is spicy with black pepper and chili powder notes that fade to reveal honey, vanilla, and caramel in the background. The finish, long with lingering spices and a subtle sweetness. I'm scoring the Black Dirt Bourbon an 88. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,250 different whiskeys from around the world at whiskycast.com.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
If you haven't checked out the latest episode of the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast yet, why not do it sometime this week? Our latest panel tasted a series of rye whiskeys, including Pikesville Rye, Old Overholt Bottled in Bond, and High West's 2018 edition of Yippee-Ki-Yay Rye. The WhiskyCast Tasting Panel is presented by The Whiskey Exchange, and you can find it at whiskycast.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, presented by Lot 40. Last time around, I mentioned our Twitter poll on whether there should be a formal definition for the term master distiller. Seems like there's pretty solid support for the idea. Even though Twitter polls aren't statistically valid, 77% of those responding said yes, while 23% said no. Mark Rainier of Ireland's Waterford Distillery used a couple of tweets to get this message across. It ought to be a title bestowed by the Worshipful Company of Distillers Livery for career recognition and achievement in distilling, or a similar institution in various countries. One of the functions the liveries provided when they were set up in the 16th century, or whenever it was to provide apprenticeships. The culmination of the journey was to become a master of one's craft. Now, if you're not familiar with the Worshipful Company of Distillers, it's based in London and is the historic guild for the UK's distilling industry. It remains very active, though a lot of its work is limited to charity events and causes. Omar Fitzel tweeted this from Cork, Ireland. Absolutely there should be. We have had a case in Ireland where master distiller was put on a bottle after someone's name, and they didn't have a distillery. Veteran West Coast craft distiller Jake Holshoe tweeted this. Hell yes, there needs to be a formal recognition of what makes a master distiller a master. Humble yourself before the craft. Stay a student for life. John Drake of the Aber Falls Distillery in North Wales had this comment. I'm a distiller. Won't live long enough or contribute enough to ever earn the title. The only thing some masters have ever mashed is potatoes. I know a man 48 years in the industry refuses the master tag. It's an industry-owned goal. There'll be ninjas next. Great points, John, but my only argument with that, we'll never have ninja distillers. You can't see or hear ninjas, and the marketing folks will never go along with that idea. We'd love to see more comments on this issue. Share them with us on social media, and you just might hear them on an upcoming episode of WhiskyCast. On a much sadder note, longtime Canadian listener Donald Hanna sent us this tweet the other night. My daughter Corey passed away tonight. To her, I raise a glass of whiskey she bought for me at the distillery last year while we vacationed on Isla. Love you always. He included a photo of Bowmore's small batch and Black Rock editions, along with a very healthy pour of one of them. Donald, we are thinking of you and your entire family this week, and we will raise a glass to Corey as well. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always post it on the Your Voice page at whiskycast.com, or find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast. Your Voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's close the show out now with Behind the Label, our look at the science, history, and other things that make whiskey unique. If you've listened to our WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast, you know that we honor a Whiskey Club of the Month on each episode. And earlier this year, we picked the Portland chapter of Women Who Whiskey. Jeneen Bell is the chapter's president, and it was a nice surprise to have her join our group of drinks writers this week at House Spirits. If you are still one of those Neanderthals out there who thinks whiskey is only for men, well, Jeneen and 300 or so of her whiskey-loving friends don't beg to differ. That would be polite. They just outright disagree with you.
Portland Women Who Whiskey chapter was the second chapter started after New York City. We have over 300 women in our group, and what we tend to do is go around to different bars and distilleries around town, tour, take tasting flights, and learn all we can about whiskey.
How big has this club grown over the last couple of years? 300 members, you've got to be pretty much the biggest Women Who Whiskey chapter.
Oh, not at all. New York, of course, being the first, is humongous. LA is quite large. Since I took over as the president about 2 years ago, we grew from 100 to 300. So I guess we're gaining 100 a year.
What makes Portland such a good city for whiskey?
We have so many good distilleries, so many great cocktails, delicious food. It's just drinking weather all year long.
And with all the breweries around here, too, it just seems like this is a paradise almost for a lot of people.
It is. I came from California where it's tough to beat, but Portland is an agricultural and cultural hub for good food, good drink, and enjoying. We take the time to enjoy it right.
What's your typical meeting like?
Well, we've actually come to House Spirits Distillery, Bull Run Distillery a couple times. We'll have the distillers take us around on a tour, guide us through a tasting flight. And we also have brand ambassadors who will come meet us at bars and talk us through their flight. We've done a couple events where it would be like a cocktail flight as well. And so the bartender talks us through those flights and how they put them together. And we learn about spirits in all different directions.
What's the ultimate goal? What do you want to do besides charter an entire plane full of Women Who Whiskey members and go to Scotland?
That is the overall goal. But the idea is to have every woman either behind or in front of the bar as knowledgeable or more knowledgeable than anybody next to them. And they know what they like and can enjoy it. That, to me personally, the more I learn about it, the more I appreciate it. The more I like it, it just tastes better the more you know.
Is Portland one of those cities where it's still intimidating for women to go to a bar and order whiskey?
So I have to say, yes, there are some places, even the previous president of Women of Whiskey went to a bar and she ordered a whiskey neat, and the bartender dared says, "Don't you want that in a cocktail, honey?" She said, "Yeah, give me my whiskey neat now." And we still hear it. You'll hear it around the bar. In front of the bar mostly is old-fashioned. That's a man's drink. Even my own father, I got him to like whiskey in his late 70s. And he's like, "That's a man's drink." I was like, "Dad, who's a beer drinker? So you have to you like beer. Whiskey is beer before it's whiskey." And then he started listening to me. But before that, his whole life, he thought it was just for men.
A lot of education you still have to do, don't you?
That's all we do, yeah. Well, although half the time we're really just enjoying it in a comfortable, relaxing, non-threatening, non-mansplaining environment.
The Portland chapter of Women Who Whiskey will resume their tastings in the fall, and there are chapters of the group in many major cities. You can listen to my 2016 interview with Women Who Whiskey founder Julia Ritz-Toffoli in episode 571. You'll find it in the archives at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find links for the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast and our WhiskyCast HD videos, along with the latest whiskey news, events, tasting notes, and a whole lot more. Our cask strength conversation continues online all week long. Look for us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast. You can always email us too. The address is comments@whiskycast.com.
This is whiskey, Johnny Walker's Scotch whiskey, from this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnny Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2018, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.